Hello everyone, this is Bradley. Today this is not a tutorial but rather an overview of what animation node can do in setting this pendulum wave animation. There are several things that I have to mention. If you have watched my last tutorial using physics, you may realize the principle is so easy that it may not be shortened anymore. In contrast, if you decided to use animation node, it will seem so complicated that I have to spend 2 tutorials talking about all these things. But I still think it's worth to make tutorials using animation nodes while it spends a lot of time. One part is that this new series of tutorial will involve some nodes that I haven't mentioned earlier. The other part is that animation node give me quite a lot of control over the system so that I can achieve the result better. As you can see in my last tutorial, I haven't done a complete replicate of system as in the reference. I just told the principle, and suppose if you follow my direction, you may potentially achieve the same result as the original author, but I don't know if this is actually a true case or not. But if you're using animation nodes, this won't really be a problem. Today, the whole point is to show you how much control I have over this entire system, so that you can decide whether you would like to learn this technique or not. So let's head into Blender. So here we are in Blender. This project file is pretty straightforward. Just kind of a brief overview about the entire texturing. It's basically a simple volumetrics, several lighting sources, emission shader, and glossy materials on the outer edges, a floor with noise texture. Also, I add kind of volume absorption or whatever kind of stuff so that this flow can go to infinity, that you won't see a very clear cutting edges in the system or so. So anyway, this is kind of idea. So let's, because today the point is not talking about this entire textual stuff, but animation, so I will basically hide all these things. So this is our main part of animation, the pendulum wave. And I want to call your attention is on what's on the right side. You have a animation node panel and you have a viewport input. I will tell you how to set this up. This is very easy to set up. The point is these inputs are basically all the controls I have for procedural modeling in this system. I can move that up. Okay. And I basically named that kind of self-explanatory, but I will still explain them. One is hanger separation. So you can see the hanger is basically these two guys. So if I enlarge them, they can separate like this. And if I decrease the number, then it will be like this. This is kind of simple thing to set up. This is probably stupid, but this is a simple thing to set up, so I made this anyway. The heavy, another thing I want to mention is the instancing. So I can change the number of all these balls. Technically speaking, I can also change where they actually start to instance, but it's kind of, I'm not going to do too much detail. But as you can see, as I'm decreasing the amount of instances, then the space between all these pendulums becomes kind of huge. So that's why I need a boss, the heavy sides, and I also need to increase the string thickness so that making kind of the entire setting more obvious, depending on what you want to do. So this is completely procedural. Hanger thickness is basically the hanger thickness. Self-explanatory enough. Other things is like holder length. So you can easily see how I changed all this value. Also holder height. Holder height actually also corresponds to the entire string. So you can see this is completely procedural. What if I'm working with, I can actually barely really imagine if I'm not working with this entire setting but modeling everything. And if I would like to change every settings, it would just basically tear my hair off from my head. Anyway, another setting is the tilting. It's basically how it works at this moment. You can see that basically the ball still stays at the ground without affecting them at all. I mean, essentially you're affecting them somehow, but it's kind of another story. yeah, there still stays on the ground if you start from 0 in the timeline. And I think I basically go through all the things. Oh yeah, one thing is magnitude. Magnitude basically means the limitation of how much this pendulum can actually go. So I can increase the numbers or decrease the numbers. It does not matter. This magnitude is just to set a limitation about how high they should go. This magnitude has nothing to do with this entire animation. So I don't need this magnitude to animate this animation. Also, another thing I want to mention is, as I have explained in other tutorials, in my other tutorials about animation nodes, currently animation node cannot be keyframed. So you have to use other kind of workaround to do all these kind of things. Which also means, if I hit ice, you can see something happens, but you won't see the magnitude anywhere in the timeline, and it just won't work. So you cannot do this. So if you would like to change the magnitude, if you want to keyframe the magnitude, then you have to use other workarounds. Like I set a control over here for some other purposes. I will explain this control later if we go to the node tree, but this is the idea. So I think I basically finished this entire part. So let's go to the animation node. So let's go into the node tree. I have to warn you at first that this node tree will be very huge if you are not familiar with animation node. So this is the node tree. If you work with animation node a lot, this is actually normal. I have to say this is actually normal. It looks kind of very complicated, very gigantic, but it's actually not that gigantic. This is your daily life at some level, if you would like to do a lot of stuff. One thing I also would like to mention is, if you really understand the logic of this entire node tree, it's not very complicated. And actually, I made them extremely complicated because I'm doing kind of lazy stuff, but you can delete a lot of green nodes if you don't want to keep them. Also, I will explain, kind of giving you an overview about what all these nodes essentially do. So I'll basically separate this node group into several parts. Some parts basically has been shown with the color. It's a kind of a loop. If you select a node in the loop or a network, if you hit E, then you can have a panel. And if you select the network, then it will select all the nodes that either directly or indirectly connect to that. So you can move them very easily. So this is one part. This is basically for the pendulum wave animation to have a very good controls over the system. And here's another set of loop. And I will basically connect them together. Basically, these are the things. Just the green loop is basically to feed some information which is required to run this animation, and the red loop is basically to generate all these streams, I think. Yes, it's basically to generate all these streams so that I don't need to model them all the times. This is procedural modeling. So then we only have one part left, this gigantic part. What I can basically tell you is, if you're looking at this part, basically it's all about procedural modeling. And basically that's it. And there are some nodes which should be obsolete that I think I put yeah, you can see there's nothing in the socket because I was trying to do something crazy, but it's not necessarily there. So you can simply delete these two nodes forever. It will not affect my animation at all. So this kind of there is some failed experiment in this node tree which makes it looks more gigantic, but while it's not necessarily being like this. Anyway, so basically, if you're looking at this part, these are all procedural modeling parts about the hanger separations, heavy sides, or kind of sort of things. So now I have an error. Just try to resolve that. Yeah. So about hanger separation, heavy sides. You can the basic principle is actually very simple. It's just you have a midpoint, and for one point you add a number, and for the other point you minus a number. So basically you need to have a lot of math in this. It's just a simple plus and minus. Like what you can see here is basically a fold mass times -1, vector mass, Crete list, something like that. It's kind of not as complicated as you can think. So basically this is what this part essentially do. And the rest of the part is basically to combine all these animation together. So I have the procedural modeling, I have the balls, I have the strings, I have basically the hanger, all the information I have. The next step is to make all this model follow the animation that I created from this purple loop. So this is basically the principle of these trees. It's actually not that hard. The hard part probably is this part, but it's a procedural modeling. You may or may not need to make this complex depending on your needs. I'm so paranoid that I want to have all these controls. That's why I made this looks very complicated while it's not necessary to be like so. Anyway, so here's one thing I have to tell you is the viewport input. It's basically a node called a viewport input node. That's why you connect them together. Before I started to do these entire things, I use float input to do all these kind of works. But later, as the time goes, I finished this entire project. I want to have all the controls concentrated into a single place. That's why I'm just use a viewport input to connect all these float input, which has been colored with kind of which color should I call it? Cyan, kind of color, green, blue, that color. Probably cyan, if I would call it. Anyway, so this is the point. So all these green node, if you would like to delete them, feel free. It has no problem. So I think this is basically it. I will still take some time to make this animation, or if I have some better thoughts, I will probably do other kinds of looping animation and showing you the tutorial. But I hope you to have an idea about what animation node can really do. It's not only for animation, it's also for modeling as well. It's basically can do a lot of procedural stuff that you haven't done in the past. And that's it. Oh, by the way, also here's one thing I have to warn you is what's on the left upper side. So this is the time to execute this entire node tree. So now this is 100 milliseconds. I think it's still less than 1 second, about 1/10 of a second. But anyway, this is abnormal. This high number is abnormal if I were to say. It's a personal experience. So usually, even if I'm working with looping animation, it's basically like a 10 milliseconds maximum, something like that. Simply because there's some issue with my loop, my purple loop animation here. It's also a problem that I currently cannot really solve. I mean, there are workarounds to make everything better, but then it will decrease the degree of proceduralness in this entire setting. That's also a thing that I'm not happy with. That's why I keep these entire settings, even if it actually takes a lot of time to execute the entire tree, and delayed my time of rendering and so on. And basically that's it. Oh, here's one thing that I forgot to mention is I have set an additional control in this empty. It's basically a set of keyframes on X location to control the sine wave. The sine wave is basically a kind of looping wave with its magnitudes going back and forth. So I also made some other tutorial like piston animation. It's basically the same principles. Pistons going back and forth from left to right, and so on and so forth. This is also the principle how pendulum essentially works. you goes left at a certain magnitude and it goes to right certain magnitude, and it's just looping throughout. Also some example you can find is basically the butterfly's wings, something like that, so on and so forth. And the reason I have set these controls because I want to clearly show several important landmarks of sine wave. They are basically 0, half of pi, and 1 pi, and 1.5 pi, and 2 pi. So this is causing the entire loop. Now I'm only have 2 here because I have set the pi's, the math of with pi in the node tree. So because pi is such a weird number that I'm not going to type in every time. It's like 3.1459. Anyway, so that's the principles. Also, I have set a graph editor because I want people to focus, have more time to focus on these several landmarks. So this is the principle. But also a trade-off is that you lost a lot of interesting animation in other periods of time. I suppose they will be actually very interesting as well. Really depends on what you are working with, like maybe 1/4 of pi. It can also be interesting, although I'm not sure. So let's increase the amount of instances to see how the wave actually should look like. So you can see the wave looks like this. It's also a very interesting pattern, if I were to say. So, which means, although my animation only looks having maybe about 2 to 4 patterns, but it can have more variation of how it has been animated, depending on how many frames you actually would like to render and what's the rate of your animation. In my cases, I'm not going to spend 100G to render all these frames. So I set the entire loop within these 3,200 frames. But it's not necessarily that this short. So you can potentially have more focus on other landmarks. So I think this landmark is also very interesting. 1/4 of pi. Or you can also change the number to other cases. It does not really matter. So this is basically the idea. Again, I think I will make a tutorial, although it might take time, and meanwhile I may probably do other tutorials as well. But if you're interested in, you can definitely comment below so I can make this tutorial faster, earlier, or whatever kind of stuff. I hope you enjoy this entire stuff, and I hope you be more interested in all this kind of procedural stuff because I think they're really cool. It's a very awesome feature in Blender.